because we have to move away from the federated search system that is currently the paradigm for government information handling and data analysis, and move into this idea of federated learning, where we can enlist the private sector fully, our allies and individuals when relevant, to actually build up this risk management system so that you can start to make the judgments and get the results that we saw in ACAS a decade ago.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Alan, I guess with what you're talking about now and transitioning from the civil service that you were and everything you learned from ACE and that you learned, and you were talking about CTPAT and everything, I guess now and you're just now talking about how in today's world now we're looking for, and like the paradigm might be the same, et cetera, but how everything has evolved. And I guess now let's transition into your private life, like the work you've been doing at Altana. How did your work in the government transition into this? Because I feel it's really interesting. We've had Amy Morgan on our show before, so we're familiar with Altana. But now the big focus, and even with CTPAT, the big focus is now on stuff like forced labor and not just the security, the supply chain security. Well, that is part of the supply chain security, but it's now focusing also on forced labor, which is a big buzzword of 2023. Green trade, I don't know how much that's going to go into and how much Altana might be looking at doing that, but it's all based on tracking and verifying and validating your supply chain. So how did that in your government work transition over into like your private life and what you're doing now with Altana?
Yeah, so after government, as a result of the experience, Lalo, that I had, that Andy and I have discussed, this idea of the importance of targeting, but targeting in the context of a risk management system that recognizes that security and trade facilitation are not in conflict, but they have to be harnessed together, and you have to make judgments in the same process. That experience led me to understand that we were entering a new phase and that we needed to develop another new paradigm. Not dramatically different from risk management, but we had to adapt risk management to a dramatically different situation. So, in fact, when I left the government and was approached by these three young data scientists and business entrepreneurs, I understood that improving targeting was actually the key element, the key ingredient. And then what's happened in the ensuing years is the world has changed and global trade has changed so dramatically in ways that we ought to explore, that a new way of even going beyond what Andy correctly identified was a completely revolutionary change in the entry system and the harnessing of ACE technology to make this happen so that you could knit together the trade community and share. But information sharing, Lalo, remained the problem. We understood that data was key. Data has become the fourth factor in addition to labor and human capital and financial capital in making things happen. But how could we make this data exchange work? So the old models that we were operating under, and frankly, we're still operating under today, is this idea that we exchange data. But remember, there are lots of things that get in the way of exchanging data and sharing information. We have sovereignty concerns. We have proprietary concerns. We have privacy concerns. And those were always the big barriers to moving forward on the information sharing, of which ACAS was a terrific embodiment of what could happen if you could share information earlier. But people still resisted the idea. Even our friendliest allies, there were limitations on how much data could be shared. Competitors in the private sector, didn't want to share information with the government about their proprietary holdings. They certainly wouldn't share it with other companies, other potential competitors. And then individuals in their private capacities didn't want to share information with either the government or with the private sector as things went. So we had this system. And the way we solved it after 9/11 and up to today is through something called federated search. So while we won't take our data and put it in a crate and go to our partner and say, here's our data, you give me your data, because that won't happen because of sovereignty, proprietary, and privacy concerns, we introduced the system of federated search, which remains in effect today. And what that basically is that you could make an individual ping, and people will open up their databases as the express carriers did in ACAS. And they say, what do you know? The government can say, what do you know about this particular shipment? And then there'd be a search in the data sets of the private sector or in other governments or with individual people, and information would be shared. You'd get a response back from your partner saying, on that particular shipment, or in the international travel context, that particular person, we know this that you ought to know. But it was still is today, a system in which data is accessed rather than shared. You have access to the data on specific inquiries. So what this led me to focus on with the people at Altana was, how do we actually create a system in which you could share risk signal without commingling data. And the advances that have taken place in information technology have actually made that possible. So we've moved from a system of federated search at Altana to federated learning. And what that is that you take advantage. In the past, because of the sovereignty, proprietary, and privacy concerns, data was maintained in silos and was not shared. But what these new information technologies involved in federated learning provide is the ability for everyone, governments, individuals, and companies, to keep their data in an individual cloud. Cloud technology has permitted us to put our data into protected, unitary data clouds. And what federated learning permits you to do is to bring the search engine to the data cloud and actually extract from the data cloud the signal about risk. Is there a high risk with regard to this shipment? And pull out that signal without actually commingling data. And when I first heard about this hub and spoke technology, I said, if we can actually make this work, it will lead to the next basic paradigm shift in which people can actually share signal without being required to commingle their data. And that's really what this hub and spoke technology that then builds models based on artificial intelligence and machine learning has permitted us to do. And it's revolutionary in the same way that the earlier federated search had been. But this opens up new networks that have become particularly important, Lalo, in the context you raise, which is we're now not only looking for counterterrorist signal or narcotics signal, which had been the focus, but rather we have a whole set of the so-called ESG concerns, the environment, social, and governance concerns, of which forced labor has taken precedence. All of these have to be taken into account in making judgments about the risk that a particular shipment presents. This is the breakthrough, I think, that's been achieved at Altana in ways that really make possible not only relying on trusted shipments the way we had at ACAS, but now you can build a network of trusted partners who can share signal without having to give up their data in ways that make this process of risk management really get to, as I say, a new level of effectiveness.
Alan, let's take that now and so that people can kind of identify with this. I'm going to give you a little bit of a scenario that some of the things that we're talking about where, let's say an example, because one of the things also that comes into play is an issue where somebody may be importing, let's say, some products, their jerseys or something, that some textiles or whatever. And, they may have the Nike brand on them or whatever. Let's say in this case, Nike would make the purchase order information available in that federated search process so that if there is a reference with the shipment that comes through and whatever criteria the CBP then would be able to do that federated search to say, hey, we've got a shipment coming in. What can you tell us with it? Is this, an authorized vendor? Is this an authorized purchase order? Is this whatever? And let that go through and come back and go, yeah, hey, this is a good one, or no, we don't know anything about that. Is that kind of a good scenario of just one of the options we're talking about here?
Yeah. So this is remember in the period of globalization that really started in the 1990s, and this gets back to Lalo's point on forced labor. We saw a vast expansion in global trade, but it was really driven by the search for low cost and working capital optimization. So we went out, and that led to the growth of manufacturing in Asia and the opening up of productive facilities at some cost here in the United States and in other developed economies, significant cost. But the point was that we were going out to get things as quickly as we can and as cheaply as we can. And those were the major concerns. As a result of that, we saw and have now seen post-pandemic, when supply chains were first put into disarray with personal protective equipment, you'll remember that. We saw this idea that, in fact, we needed to have much greater visibility on the supply chain. And it couldn't just be knowing your first tier supplier, which is really what we had gotten to. You knew who you were getting a shipment from, but you didn't know the second, third, or fourth tier. You didn't know your supplier. And what we started to find in the area of forced labor, but it's coming in other areas on the ESG agenda, that in fact, there were a lot of pernicious things happening back in the supply chain that nobody had any visibility on. In fact, there was a premium on not knowing. People would just as soon not know what was in their supply chain. But as we move into a dramatic change in the regulatory system, forced in the aftermath of the pandemic, but also with the focus now on forced labor, but also with the reemergence of geopolitical tensions in the world, having to know what's coming from China with regard to tariff regulations, what's being transshipped from China to through Vietnam or elsewhere. All of this now has placed a premium on this idea that we have to go back 3 or 4 levels in the supply chain. And there's a rush going on now in the private sector to meet this. What we haven't seen yet is the coming together that we saw in ACAS. And that's what I project and predict is going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years as we start to build up trusted networks where you will see the use of federated learning that can actually extract the signal from the data sets without commingling the data in ways that permit, Andy, CBP to do exactly what you pointed out in the Nike case. So in fact, you get a signal by going back 2, 3, or 4 levels in the supply chain, and you realize that the cotton that was involved in the production of that T-shirt was grown in Xinjiang in Western China, which has been the subject of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, that really now is the issue confronting the public and private sectors alike, because it's created huge challenges for both. And it's interesting. We started with the Yemen cargo plot because I really do believe that we're at the threshold of a new era. Might call it globalization 2.0, in which there's going to be new use of technology, but building on the trust and confidence that's been developed over the last 10 to 15 years. You're going to see a lot more access to data sets through federated learning that will permit this supply chain visibility and permit both the public sector to regulate more effectively, but the private sector to achieve its goal of compliance, but also accelerated shipment.
Well, more now than ever, the level of, the amount of information that a compliance group would have to look at on behalf of a company and look through all of that and deal with, there is no way you could do that from a human perspective. It's got to be done through systems, and taking that a step further through automation, and the use of artificial intelligence is a big deal. Use of, databases and sharing information and all that. With that, what is it that you would say to, shall we say, develop a company's looking at it going, hey, I want to be that good corporate citizen. I want to move into this next era. What would you recommend for the leadership as well as the compliance groups of those companies? What action do they need to take at this point?
So this is first is to build in the proposition of supply chain visibility, to understand that you simply can't put your head in the sand and say we didn't know, because in fact the requirements of the new regulatory structure that CBP is implementing requires due diligence, that you've got to exercise reasonable care, and that you are responsible for what's coming into your product that you're then shipping into more developed markets. So supply chain visibility is the first. The second is to really elevate this from the compliance area to the C-suite. See, what we understand now, and what your question implied, Andy, is that compliance and trade compliance people know the problem now. They know what they're responsible for, but they haven't yet been given the resources or the authority to actually do the kind of search that will be there. And it's, Altana, I think, is at the forefront of this development, but there are other companies that are jumping into the space. So the second thing you have to do is do a real survey of what's available in the private sector technology market to permit you to do this. And then the third thing that you have to do is build in the corporate will to make the changes that you have to make in order to be compliant, so that your shipment is not being detained by CBP. Now, on the government side, equal change is required, because we have to move away from the federated search system that is currently the paradigm for government information handling and data analysis, and move into this idea of federated learning, where we can enlist the private sector fully, our allies and individuals, when relevant, to actually build up this risk management system so that you can start to make the judgments and get the results that we saw in ACAS a decade ago.
Well, with where we're going with this now is going to be a scenario where, again, government, private sector, like you said, needs to come together. I would say that definitely the regulatory affairs groups of companies probably need to step in. So this is where I guess it's to your point, the compliance group usually will have a good understanding of the situation, but they're going to have to translate this complexity into language and terminology, if you will, the C-suite can understand. And I'm not saying the C-suite's dumb. I'm just saying that they're not used to doing the compliance. That's one of the areas that I always challenge our compliance folks out there is don't go into the C-suite with your dissertation of all the regulations and everything. You got to break that down and put it into more layman terms for them to understand. That's one thing. But the most important would be, what is it that you're looking for from the C-suite? And if it is, we need to go down this road to engage automation into the compliance aspect, and that will eventually get into the operations and the streamlining it. Those kinds of things like that, to me, would be something that an expert of people like at Altana and some of the other companies, the compliance folks probably need to reach out to say, I need help in how to communicate this message. Would that be a good aspect of it, or what do you think?
No, absolutely. I think the idea of what we're seeing are demonstrations, and you need to get, as you always do in a process of change, you need to get early adapters, and then you need to start to do what we described earlier, Andy, which is you need to start persuading people of the logic of this and the requirements for it. And then the change starts to take place and gathers as you start to invest in these technologies. But in the same way we saw after 9/11, where we saw the investment in federated search, we now need to see an investment in federated learning, but also a paradigm change where we begin to really take seriously and understand that, in fact, we can share signal, we can share risk signal without giving up specific data. And that we can do this in ways that create networks that will permit cargo to flow quickly, efficiently, and securely through the ports of entry as we shrink the haystack through a new technique.
Well, one of the things I guess I look at is the cause and effect. So to me, is at different ports or in a company, that if you are receiving, where would the indicator be? To me, it would be if you are receiving an increase in CF28s and 29s. And for those folks that are listeners that may not understand that, that's a Customs Form 28, Customs Form 29. And a 28 is an official inquiry into a shipment. You want the CBP officers want more information. A CF29 is, there's been some kind of action taken based on what they're seeing, but you still have information on it. CF28s and 29s to me would be one of the first indicators that, hey, you may need to, as a company, if you're getting 28s and 29s, there's a black hole in some information there that needs to be looked at and evaluated and say, what additional information maybe that I need to provide, or, reach out to the C's, if you will, of customs and some of them to see what's going on, or reach out to an expert. Again, I come back to Altana or some of the other companies out there to say, get somebody to look at it and say, what's going on here? Why is there a black hole? Would you agree with that?
Yes. And in fact, the adverse effect, in addition to the audits of CF28s and then actions of CF29, is when your shipment is actually detained at a port of entry, and you start incurring the delays and the costs that are inherent in that process. If you want to get ahead of that, and this requires the steps that you've suggested on the private sector, I would also suggest that it requires a shift, which is actually underway now at CBP, which is utilizing Altana and the machine learning and artificial intelligence tools in its sifting. But what we have to recognize is that we're in this new era of so-called globalization 2.0, where forced labor, the green trade, sanctions against Russian oligarchs, and tariffs on Chinese goods are all now on the desk of our trade compliance people and our trade enforcement people at CBP. On the government side, there needs to be a real understanding that In fact, they need to be more transparent with the private sector about what the problem is, in the same way that took place during the ACAS pilot. There needs to be an expansion of that, so that, in fact, we can start to build the relationships that will build the confidence that, in fact, this network, this trusted network, actually exists. So right now, when a shipment's detained, many companies are submitting thousands of pages of documents to CBP, many that need translation. It's a hugely expensive process, and CBP can't handle thousands of pages of documents. So you're exactly right. The private sector, and the burden is shifted so that the private sector has to produce it in a readable, comprehensible form, but
in a very short window.
In a short window of the review process. But CBP at the same time has to be more transparent than simply sending back a notice saying denied. You have to be more transparent on the regulator side to say, here's the problem that we continue to see. That is a critical need on the government side, but then the private sector has to be prepared to respond to it once that information is provided, and then exercise due diligence way in advance, so that in fact you have a good idea of what's in your supply chain, and you don't wait till a shipment's detained to go out and say, hey, we really need to know who's the supplier here. That data will become institutionalized in the new process of global trade that's emerging.
Well, one of the things I want to switch here, we've talked about the compliance, maybe raising this up and doing, putting together, if you will, some information to try and generate some support and activity by the C-suite. Let me switch gears here a little bit. Alan, can you talk to the C-suite, the CEOs, the COOs, the top executives of companies, and what is it that, I guess, what would be maybe the top 1, 2, or 3 questions that they should be asking within their organization to try and start pulling something together to see if there's an issue that they need to talk about from their end?
Yeah, so there are many enterprises now that actually have gotten it, and their compliance people have the resource support, the authority support to make the kind of transformation that we've been talking about here. But the first question and you don't want to wait till word gets up to the CEO that 2/3 of your shipments are being detained in the ports of entry around the country. So the first question really that should be asked is, again, what do we know about our supply chain? How far can we go back into the supply chain? And what is it going to take to get the visibility we need now to respond to the vast change that's taken place in the regulatory system? Lalo mentioned forced labor. Well, with the implementation in 2021 of the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, we've really entered a new phase of a new regulatory regime in the United States, and soon enough in the European Union, where the burden is shifted to the private sector. So under the UFLPA, anything that can be identified as coming from Xinjiang is presumed to have been produced with forced labor. That's a dramatic change from the past, where in order to detain a shipment, CBP, using CF-28s and other tools, would actually have to do an investigation and then say to the private sector, we've discovered this problem. How do you propose to resolve it? We can't wait for that any longer in terms of global trade in the United States. You have to get ahead of the problem. It's not good enough anymore for someone to say, well, we'll wait until CBP raises the issue with us. Because in fact, the regulatory regime places the burden on the private sector to demonstrate compliance. That's happened with forced labor. I would predict that over the next decade, that's going to happen in the green trade context. And it's already, frankly, in effect with regard to sanctions practice. And similar kinds of tariff issues that have been implemented as we see the tensions grow between the United States and China on the trade front.
Well, on that, there's going to be the expectation. I mean, China's made it clear in the last meeting between China and the U.S., where China has said they are planning within the year to take Taiwan back. With that kind of scenario, and as we go through, I see that being another major event, if in fact that does happen, where what does the U.S. do? Do we completely sever trade with China as well as then we lose Taiwan? What's that going to do to the U.S. economy and the supply chains and those kinds of things?
It would be a disaster and a catastrophe of the first order for that to happen. In fact, it can't happen. And I think what Xi Jinping and President Biden recognize is that we now have an interdependent system of global trade. It's going to change in the ways that we've discussed, but that in fact, if this were to rupture completely, there would be a dramatic impact on the world economy in ways that would do great damage both to the Chinese people, but also to the American people. So the art of leadership right now is how do we recognize that we are now in a competitive strategic competition with China. But if it breaks out into a kinetic conflict, it would be a utter catastrophe for the world. And I trust that our leaders on both sides and around the world in a new multipolar world understand that. The Taiwan issue would take us into other waters, Andy, but I think what happens in the contest between and the war between Ukraine and Russia will have a lot to do with whether we have to face similar problems in the Chinese context downstream.
Well, and to your point, I mean, with those kinds of things going on, I guess I come back to what we've been talking about is when a new variable is introduced into the supply chain due to regulatory, due to geopolitical situations, due to whatever, to manage that, you cannot do that, again, from a human perspective. It's got to be done with systems and automation, hence what we've been talking about. There are things that are going to be hitting all of us at some point that, we've never couldn't even fathom. So having the tools, and we've, again, the evolution here of the way things have gone, having the tools from a company, from a government perspective, using artificial intelligence, using automation, using, data, whatever, and using it quickly and early on in the process is going to be paramount, I think, for the future.
And the second element is partnership.
Yes.
And that's why I emphasize that both the private sector and the public sector need to they need to supercharge and turbocharge what happened in ACAS, where we started this discussion, in order to build the trust and confidence in the networks that'll permit us to respond to these unknowns right now, when they occur, in ways that won't lead to the president of GM having to call President Biden, but rather we have in place the understandings, the techniques, and most of all, the trust and confidence and the partnership that will be required to make this work successfully.
All right. How, from your perspective, how can the private sector right now support CBP in moving that partnership concept forward? What do you think we need to do to help support CBP in that effort?
Build up the capacity to be transparent. Build up the capacity to know your supply chain, be willing to share the signals that you have, and reciprocally to have CBP be much more transparent in responding and get ahead of these problems, very much on the theory that we discussed before, but to do it through a federated learning technology and not be limited to federated search, and then just to understand that this is a challenge that we confront together.
Alan, this has been a fantastic discussion. I could keep on going, and I'm tempted to do it, but I for sake of time here, I think we do need to wrap this particular show up. I know that I want to see us all have further discussions, but with that, folks, I got to tell you, this is a show that you need to probably back up and listen several times. If you're from the compliance area, you need to look at it from a standpoint that there are some definitive actions. There's some information that you need to get proficient on, and things that you need to move and collaborate with other departments in your company to raise this up to the C-suite. From the leadership perspective of a company, there's some definitive things, again, that you need to be asking the right questions that Alan has so rightly pointed out. And from customs perspective, man, you guys, you folks are such a great group of people. And I'm hoping that you'll reach out to us, that if you have some programs that you want to come on the show, we'll talk about them to try and promote this from a government, private sector, whatever we can do. But, Alan, man, thank you so much for a great discussion today.
And thank you. Let me just end where you led us, Andy, which is Customs and Border Protection, the largest law enforcement agency in the country. I've got to take my hat off to the men and women who have actually undergone this change, taken this transformation, and they are, for the first time, I would have to say it, they're actually ahead of the private sector in terms of having people at every level of the organization. The coordination between the Office of Field Operations and the Office of Trade that has taken a new paramount role in all of these issues. It's really quite remarkable and lauded. And I take my hat off to them, because this has not been an easy process of change. And frankly, we're not even 1/3 of the way through it yet. But the people of CBP will have responded in a remarkable, very impressive way. And I would urge the private sector folks to take their willingness to share problems with their contacts, whether it's at the Centers for Excellence and Expertise and Excellence and Expertise at CEs, or at the Trusted Trader Program at CTPAT, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. Call up your colleagues at the working level at CBP. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and say, I want to share a problem that's on my desk. What do you think? What do you think? And in the past, that would have been a no-no. It's happening much more. And I think that our private sector operational folks will find the operational people at CBP in a very different frame of mind than they may imagine. And that the CBP officers understand that their job is to work with the private sector, not to bypass problems, but to confront them and to do it together in ways that will open up new opportunities for the private sector that haven't yet been realized.
Well said, my friend. Well said. Lalo, I think we need to wrap up here, but listen, we're going to wind up chopping this up into several shows, I think, because we have talked about so many things here. And I'm looking forward to another session with you, Alan.
I'm looking forward as well, Andy. Thank you and Lalo for the opportunity. It's terrific what you've done at Simply Trade, and I know how many people rely on the show, and I commend you for taking what Lalo rightly called an educational process to the next level.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that tuned in, and please share this, and just to get this out to everyone, and do comment. I mean, we like I said, we will have this on video on YouTube here in very soon, and hopefully that'll be a way that y'all can comment either there or LinkedIn. But thank you very much, and y'all have a good day. Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.